Michael Parenti, is Bush a failure? Obviously in reference to George Bush, who was often portrayed as an idiot, as an imbecile, as somebody who was making the ridiculous policy decisions that he was making by accident. You know, he got us into Iraq not because he was working on behalf of the oil companies to manufacture a war and justification for war, but he fell into the Iraq war because he thought he was doing the right thing, or he was just so stupid. He was such an imbecile. He didn't know what he was doing all along. It was all a big accident. That was kind of how Bush was portrayed by the media, or the media that didn't like him, the Democratic media, as just this dumb guy. And here, Parenti is kind of going to challenge that idea. So without giving it away or saying any more, let's just play it.
TV, the world is thinking.
Bush is...
Sorry to pause it already, but I already like what Sean Moon is saying. Absolutely not a failure. A successful class warrior on behalf of the capitalist class. That's one of the things I say all the time. Class warfare is two-sided, and there are capitalists like the Koch brothers who spent all their money influencing the education system and the higher education system to teach neoliberal Milton Friedman economics, or people like George Bush, or people like Hillary Clinton, who are warriors on behalf of the capitalist class, right? They understand that they need to fight the class struggle in order to maintain their place on top of class society. And so they wage that struggle on behalf of the capitalists as hard as they can, right? Class struggle doesn't just mean working class struggle. That's what we need to organize. That's what we want more of. But the capitalist class is also struggling against us. And some capitalists are more conscious of that than others, and more engaged in suppressing us than others. All right, I'll shut up.
Bush is described as a failed administration. Right? We're hearing that all the time. Now, are you going to repeat that phrase because you've heard someone else say it? Or are you going to say, what failure? You're going to repeat my phrase. What failure? You're going to say, what wrong turns? The estate tax has been eliminated. Corporate taxes have been cut back to almost nothing. Billions in Medicare are being handed over to the big pharmaceutical companies. We had no choice on this. Military budget has doubled. Record profits for the defense industry, record corporate profits. Human services have been cut back or held flat. All the Great Society programs are pretty much gutted and defunded. Wages remain flat or have declined. 2 presidential elections have been stolen. Read the book, it's in there, a chapter on that. The super rich are richer than ever. You tell me where the failure is. When George Bush came into office, oil was $20 a barrel. 7 years later, oil is $100 a barrel. Is that a failure or a success?
The only way that you could call George Bush a failure is if you don't know who he's working for. If you don't know what class he is working at the behest of, which is the capitalist class, which makes their money through the exploitation and subsequent suppression of the working class, the working masses, the majority of society. So yeah, his policies may have been a failure for the country as a whole, the majority of people living in this country, but for a specific capitalist class, whom are the people that George Bush serves, he was extremely successful. The only way he wasn't successful is that George Bush was kind of a madman, right? He was like, Obama was able to start the wars with Syria and Libya, and, you know, people still think his biggest controversy was when he wore a tan suit. You know, he was able to invade those countries and destroy Libya much more covertly. Whereas Bush was just like, let's invade Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror, and we're going to do it. And, you know, hell and fire and fury. Kind of took the mask off of the empire in a way. But it was still very successful from the perspective of oil oligarchs and weapons contractors.
Well, it depends on what side of the gas pump you're standing, isn't it? For us, it's a failure of an administration. Something's really wrong. For the guys who run the oil companies, it's heaven. It's paradise. Even in the area of foreign policy, there have been setbacks, it's true, but much success. U.S. military power has established a presence in the Middle East and in a place it has almost never been before in its entire history, with major permanent bases in Central Asia, in countries which most Americans don't even know exist and whose names they can't pronounce. Large permanent military bases. Iraq, well, Iraq has been very good to about 100 U.S. corporations in billions of dollars in contracts at a level of profit that's the hottest thing going in the last 4 years. The hottest area of investment has been getting in on the Iraq gravy.
Exactly. Everyone says Iraq was a failure because it was a strategic failure. It destabilized the country. It created these terror groups like ISIS. Everyone says Afghanistan was a failure because we leave and nothing has changed. The Taliban is still in power, and Afghanistan has hardly developed their infrastructure at all. But the ruling class got what they wanted out of these wars, right? The oil companies got off scot-free in the case of Iraq. All of Iraq's oil wealth essentially was handed over to Western multinationals, and it remains that way to this day. So yeah, they toppled Iraq's central government and created a power vacuum where all these different groups, including a lot of jihadist extremist groups, would fight for the power. And that made it so the U.S. had to stay there and occupy the country for years. And many American soldiers died. Millions of Iraqis died. So that's a failure from a human perspective, or from the perspective of any working class person or anyone who was tricked into joining the U.S. military and sent over there to get PTSD. But from the perspective of the oil companies, it was a success. Their profits went up. The line went up. That means society good. Thank you so much for the super chat, Leo. Appreciate you, brother. Parenti is definitely a giga Chad. No doubt about that.
1/3 of the Pentagon budget for Iraq is unaccounted for. The Pentagon admits at least 1/3. It may be even more. Again, that's a failure as far as administering for the public interest and the commonweal. But it's a smashing success if you're on the take and you're in there scooping up the gravy. Free trade is going into its final phase and is destroying local markets and production. It's wiping out the entire Mexican peasant class. That's why we're getting so many of these people wanting to come. You think they just so love to freeze their butts off in the Bay Area? And Mexico's a wonderful place.
Imperialism creates immigration. And that's a process that Marx talks a lot about in Capital Volume 1. This is actually Volume 3, but he calls it the enclosure of the commons. When you have capitalism spread to places where there's different kinds of modes of production, like, say, peasant workers who produce a lot of their own means of subsistence, you need to get rid of them in order for capitalism to take hold. Because, for one, capitalism needs that land. The capitalists need the land that the peasants are working. And two, capitalism needs an army of wage laborers. So they need to divorce people from the means of production, tools, and from the land. So that people's only option is to sell their labor to a capitalist. That's the only way they can survive. That was still taking place, even in modern day in places like Mexico, where capitalism spread and free trade was enforced on them. And it created what Marx would call the enclosure of the commons. The peasants were pushed off their land, forced to immigrate to the United States or sell their wages to a capitalist. And, back when capitalism was first kicking off in Europe, a lot of people starved because they couldn't find any way to produce their means of subsistence anymore, or they couldn't find a capitalist to sell their wages to. And even if they could, they were in absolute destitution during the Industrial Revolution and whatnot. So, and in China, a lot of what they've done, this is part of their poverty alleviation plans, and this is part of their combating capitalism and building a socialist society, is they've given people these plots of land where they can grow their own means of subsistence, where they can grow their own food. So it's, you know, not divorcing these people from the land, not divorcing people from the means of production and the ability to create their own means of subsistence, but actually encouraging them and incentivizing them to grow their own means of subsistence and produce for themselves. So they're less dependent on the market, less dependent on selling their wage labor. That's in a lot of the rural regions of China.
They often have no choice, and it's got the pressure for immigration to go and try and find a living is getting more and more desperate. Free trade is extending corporate control over every corner of the Earth's remaining resources. Free trade elevates the right to property above all other rights that exist, including national sovereignties to defend democratic rights.
That quote at the end reminds me of Domenico Lacerdo's graph that I talk about all the time, where the Western liberal tradition protects private property over all else, individual mastery over private property, which is what is protected by the state. And then they also, you know, claim to protect civil and political rights, although right to private property comes first and is often used as justification to infringe on civil and political rights. Then you have identity politics that grows out of that versus the Hegelian, Marxist, and Chinese tradition. Sovereignty comes first. Democracy comes first. The people's right to determine their own destiny, a nation's right to determine their own future and their own politics and their own economic system. What grows out of that, the next most important part is right to economic well-being, protecting the material needs or meeting the material needs of the society and the people in it. And then what grows out of that is protection for civil, political, cultural, and environmental rights. So as Parenti said, in the liberal tradition and with liberal imperialism, individual mastery over private property is often placed above sovereignty. So if a country wants to move towards socialism, if they want to move away from liberalism or neoliberalism, the U.S. will do a regime change effort or put that country under sanctions or invade that country and take away their sovereignty in order to protect private property. And I couldn't help but think when Parenti said it's working for the oil companies, the system and George Bush is working for the oil companies. He's not a failure for them. He's just a failure for the workers. It reminds me of Kamala Harris saying Bidenomics is working. It is working for the ruling class. It is working for the people who have plundered Ukraine's economy, for BlackRock and Vanguard and shareholders and speculators on Wall Street. It's working for them. It's not working for the working masses. It's not working for the 60% of Americans who have healthcare debt. It's not working for the 8 and 10 elderly people with dementia or Alzheimer's who can't pay for memory care. It's not working for the Americans who can't retire. It's not working for the 40,000 people who die every single year because they don't have access to basic health insurance. Right? Bidenomics is not working for the masses, but it is working for the ruling class and the shareholders. And Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, that's who they serve.